In the year 1260, the world trembled before a force unlike anything history had ever witnessed. From the steppes of Mongolia, a war machine had emerged that devoured empires, obliterated civilizations, and left behind nothing but ash and silence. For over 4 decades, the Mongol armies had carved through continents like a scythe through wheat. No fortress could contain them. No army could withstand them. No prayer could save those who stood in their path. But on a scorching September day near a spring called Ain Jalut, the unstoppable would meet the immovable. What happened there would shatter the myth of Mongol invincibility and alter the course of world history forever. This is the story of how David faced Goliath once more, and how a single battle saved not just Egypt, but the entire Islamic world from complete annihilation. The terror began in Baghdad 3 years earlier. Picture this. You're living in one of the greatest cities on earth, a center of learning and culture that has stood for 5 centuries. The House of Wisdom contains the accumulated knowledge of civilizations. Scholars from across the known world come to study in your libraries. Your markets overflow with goods from India to Spain. Life is good. Then one morning, you wake to the sound of war horns, unlike anything you've ever heard. The Mongols have arrived. What followed was 10 days of systematic destruction that defied comprehension. Conservative estimates put the death toll at 200,000 souls. But the numbers tell only part of the story. The Mongols didn't just kill people, they murdered knowledge itself. Ancient manuscripts that had survived since the time of Alexander were hurled into the Tigris River. Eyewitnesses claimed the water ran black with ink for weeks. The House of Wisdom, that beacon of human learning, was reduced to rubble and flame. This wasn't warfare as the medieval world understood it. This was the methodical erasure of civilization. The architect of this devastation was Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan and brother to the great Khan Monka. Unlike his predecessors who conquered for wealth or territory, Hulagu seemed driven by something far more terrifying, a vision of absolute dominion that would reshape the world according to Mongol design. The army he commanded was unlike anything the earth had seen. By order of the great Khan himself, 2/10 of the entire Mongol Empire's fighting force had been assembled for this Western campaign. Think about that for a moment. The largest empire in human history had gathered 1/5 of its military might into a single, unstoppable fist. This wasn't just cavalry charging across open plains. Hulagu's force included 1,000 squads of Chinese siege engineers, experts who could reduce any fortress to rubble, catapults that could hurl stones the size of wine barrels, mangonels that could punch holes through walls 10 feet thick, and behind these engines of war marched warriors from every corner of the known world. Mongol heavy cavalry and lacquered armor, Turkish horse archers who could put arrows through mail at 200 paces, Georgian knights fighting alongside their conquerors, even Frankish crusaders who had thrown in their lot with the Mongols. The organizational genius behind this force was as terrifying as its size. While European armies were loose collections of feudal levies, the Mongols operated with decimal precision. Units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 moved with clockwork coordination. When a Mongol general gave an order, it rippled through the ranks with mathematical certainty. Resistance was not just futile. It was literally impossible to organize against such overwhelming discipline. After Baghdad fell, the dominoes began to topple with sickening speed. Damascus, the pearl of Syria, surrendered without a fight rather than face Baghdad's fate. Aleppo opened its gates. One by one, the great cities of the Islamic world bowed before the Mongol war machine. Those who resisted were obliterated so thoroughly that grass grew over their ruins. Those who surrendered survived, but as vassals to a power that stretched from Korea to the Mediterranean. By 1260, Hulagu's banners flew from the walls of every major city in Syria. His scouts probed south toward Egypt, the last independent Muslim power in the region. In Cairo, Sultan Qutuz received reports that made his blood run cold. The Mongols were coming for him next, and based on every precedent, his beautiful capital would soon join Baghdad in ashes. But then something extraordinary happened, something that would change everything. Hulagu Khan made a mistake. In late 1259, word reached Syria that great Khan Monka had died in distant China. The death of the supreme ruler triggered a succession crisis that demanded the presence of every major Mongol leader. Hulagu faced an impossible choice. He could remain in Syria and risk losing his claim to power in the imperial succession, or he could abandon his conquest at the moment of triumph to play politics in Karakoram. Politics won. Hulagu departed Syria with the bulk of his massive army, leaving behind only a single tumen under his general Kitbuqa. 10,000 men to hold conquests that had required 200,000 to achieve. For the first time in decades, the Mongol war machine had exposed a weakness. In Cairo, Sultan Qutuz recognized the opportunity that fortune had placed before him. Here was a man who understood that some moments in history arrive only once, and that hesitation means extinction. When Hulagu's envoys arrived demanding Egypt's surrender, Qutuz gave them his answer. He had their heads mounted on the gates of Cairo for all to see. The message was clear. Egypt would not bow. Egypt would fight. But fighting the Mongols required more than courage. It demanded soldiers who could match their legendary skill. Fortunately for the Islamic world, Egypt possessed something unique: the Mamluks. These weren't ordinary warriors. The Mamluks were slave soldiers, purchased as boys and trained from childhood in the arts of war. 4 disciplines defined their education: horsemanship that let them control their mounts with knee pressure alone, archery that could thread a needle at full gallop, lance work that could punch through mail and bone, swordplay so refined that master swordsmen practiced by striking a dummy target 1,000 times in succession. When a Mamluk warrior reached maturity, he was no longer a slave but a member of an elite military caste. These men lived for battle. They knew no trade but war, no loyalty but to their brotherhood, no fear of death if it came with honor. In Europe, knights trained for warfare between harvests. Mamluks trained for warfare between battles. 20,000 of these warrior monks now marched north from Cairo under Qutuz's banner. At their head rode Baibars, a general who knew the terrain of northern Palestine like a lover knows their beloved's face. Years earlier, as a fugitive hiding in these very hills, Baibars had memorized every wadi, every ridge, every hidden path. Now that intimate knowledge would serve a greater purpose. As the two armies converged on a place called Ain Jalut, the Goliath Spring, neither side could know they were about to witness history's pivot point. The Mongols came expecting another easy victory over terrified enemies. The Mamluks came, knowing they carried the hopes of the entire Islamic world on their shoulders. What happened next would echo through the centuries, proving that even the mightiest empires can stumble when they meet the right enemy at the right moment in the right place. The dawn of September 3rd, 1260, broke over the Jezreel Valley with an ominous stillness. The air hung heavy with the promise of violence, and both armies could feel the weight of destiny pressing down upon them like a stone. This was no ordinary battlefield. This was the place where legends would be born and empires would bleed. Kitbuqa's Mongol force moved with their characteristic precision, 10,000 horsemen flowing across the landscape like a river of steel and death. These weren't the raw recruits of lesser armies. These were the inheritors of Genghis Khan's legacy, warriors who had learned their craft in the conquest of nations. Their horses, though smaller than the Mamluk war horses, possessed an endurance forged on the endless steppes. Their composite bows could loose arrows with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop. Their discipline was absolute. But something was different here. For the first time in their western campaign, the Mongols weren't facing terrified city dwellers or feudal levies. Across the valley, the Mamluks sat their heavy war horses in perfect formation, their armor gleaming in the morning sunday. These weren't men hoping to survive. These were men who had trained their entire lives for precisely this moment. Baibars understood what many generals never grasp. Battles aren't won by the strongest army or the largest force. They're won by the commander who best understands the ground beneath his feet and the enemy before his eyes. The terrain around Ain Jalut was perfect for what he had in mind. Rolling hills provided concealment. Rocky ground would slow cavalry charges, and the positioning he'd chosen would force the Mongols to fight with the rising sun in their eyes. The battle began with a deception so audacious it would have impressed Sun Tzu himself. Baibars took a small force forward, perhaps 1,000 men, and began what appeared to be harassment attacks. His riders would charge toward the Mongol line, loose their arrows, then wheel away in apparent disorder. Again and again they repeated this pattern, each time seeming more desperate, more disorganized. To Kitbuqa, watching from his command position, the display confirmed everything he knew about his enemies. These Muslims might be brave, but they lacked the discipline for real warfare. Their attacks were poorly coordinated. Their retreats looked like routs. After hours of these pinprick assaults, the Mongol general had seen enough. When Baibars' latest charge dissolved into what looked like panicked flight, Kitbuqa made his decision. The Mongol pursuit began with thunderous precision. 10,000 horses surged forward in pursuit of what appeared to be a broken enemy. The ground shook beneath their hooves, the air filled with their battle cries. This was the moment they lived for, the final charge that would add another victory to their endless string of conquests. But as they crested the hills in pursuit of Baibars' fleeing force, the Mongols discovered they had ridden into the jaws of hell itself. From concealed positions in the rocky terrain, the main Mamluk army erupted like a volcano. 15,000 heavy cavalry, their lances leveled, their battle cries shaking the heavens, smashed into the Mongol flanks with devastating force. The impact was catastrophic. Horses screamed and fell. Men tumbled from their saddles into the crushing press of bodies. The famous Mongol discipline shattered under the weight of perfectly executed ambush tactics. But the Mamluks had one more surprise waiting in their arsenal. As the melee reached its peak, strange thunder began to echo across the battlefield. Not the thunder of hooves or the clash of weapons, but something new and terrifying. From the Mamluk ranks came flashes of fire and clouds of acrid smoke. The Mamluks were deploying hand cannons, crude firearms they called midfa, for perhaps the first time in military history. These early guns weren't particularly deadly as weapons. Their range was short, their accuracy poor, their rate of fire abysmal, but their psychological impact was devastating. The Mongol horses, trained to ignore the clash of swords and the whistle of arrows, had never encountered anything like the deafening roar and sulfurous stench of gunpowder weapons. Panic spread through their ranks like wildfire. In the crushing press of combat, the Mamluks' superior armor and weapons began to tell. Their heavy lances punched through Mongol mail. Their curved sabers, forged by Damascus smiths, carved through leather and bone. Their war horses, bred for power rather than endurance, trampled their lighter opponents into the bloody earth. Kitbuqa, realizing his force was trapped and dying, made the choice of a true warrior. Rather than flee and live with shame, he spurred his horse toward the thickest fighting. The Mongol general died as he had lived, with a weapon in his hand and defiance on his lips. Some accounts say he fell in the melee. Others claim he was captured and executed after declaring that Hulagu would return to avenge this defeat. Either way, his death marked the end of an era. The rout that followed was complete and merciless. The survivors of Kitbuqa's army fled toward the town of Beisan, 8 miles away, with the Mamluks in hot pursuit. There they turned to make another stand, perhaps hoping that desperation would restore their legendary fighting spirit. It didn't matter. The myth of Mongol invincibility had been shattered on the rocks of Ain Jalut, and no amount of courage could put it back together. The slaughter at Beisan was even more complete than the main battle. Mongol warriors who had terrorized the world from China to Poland died in a foreign valley, far from the steppes that had birthed their empire. Their bodies littered the ground like broken dolls, testament to what happened when the unstoppable finally met something that refused to move. As the sun set on September 3rd, the impossible had become reality. The Mongol war machine lay in ruins. The survivors scattered like leaves before a storm, carrying with them news that would shake the foundations of the known world. For the first time in over 40 years, the sons of Genghis Khan had tasted defeat. But the true magnitude of what had happened at Ain Jalut wouldn't become clear until the days and weeks that followed. Within 5 days, Damascus had fallen back into Muslim hands. Within a month, Aleppo followed. The great Mongol expansion westward, which had seemed as inevitable as the sunrise, ground to a permanent halt at the borders of Egypt. The battle's impact rippled outward, like waves from a stone dropped in still water. In Europe, where kings had trembled at reports of Mongol advances, there was cautious celebration. In the Islamic world, where extinction had seemed certain, there was jubilation mixed with disbelief. The religion of Muhammad would survive. The civilization of the caliphs would endure. And in the royal courts from London to Constantinople, a new name was whispered with something approaching awe. Baibars the crossbow, the general who had turned Mongol tactics against the Mongols themselves, the man who had saved not just Egypt, but perhaps the entire course of human civilization. The reverberations of Ain Jalut spread faster than any messenger could ride. In the bazaars of Cairo, merchants who had prepared for exile now celebrated in the streets. In the mosques of Damascus, imams who had expected to witness the end of Islam instead offered prayers of thanksgiving. And in the camps of fleeing Mongol survivors, warriors who had never known defeat struggled to comprehend a world where their empire could bleed. But perhaps nowhere was the shock more profound than in the mind of Hulagu Khan himself. When word reached him in distant Azerbaijan, the great conqueror reportedly flew into a rage so terrible that his own guards feared to approach him. The nephew of the great Khan, the destroyer of Baghdad, the man who had brought civilization itself to its knees, had been humbled by a force he had barely considered worthy of his attention. Hulagu's first instinct was revenge. He began gathering his scattered forces, calling in debts and favors from across his vast domain. The full weight of the Mongol Empire would descend upon Egypt like an avalanche. The Mamluks had won a battle, but they had awakened a sleeping dragon that would consume them all. Yet even as Hulagu marshaled his strength, the political realities of his empire worked against him. The succession crisis that had drawn him away from Syria now exploded into open warfare. His cousin Ber Khan, ruler of the Golden Horde, had converted to Islam and viewed Hulagu's destruction of Baghdad as a personal affront. Along the northern borders of the Ilkhanate, Mongol fought Mongol in a civil war that would drain resources and attention away from any thoughts of reconquest. The irony was exquisite. The very empire that had conquered the world through unity now tore itself apart through division. While Hulagu dreamed of revenge against the Mamluks, he found himself fighting for survival against his own kinsmen. The window of opportunity that had opened for the Islamic world at Ain Jalut would remain open not for months but for years. Baibars understood this gift of time better than anyone. Within weeks of his victory, he had transformed from a general into a force of nature. His armies swept through Syria like wildfire, reclaiming fortress after fortress that had fallen to Mongol rule. But his genius lay not just in tactics, but in psychology. He understood that fear had been the Mongols' greatest weapon, and now he would turn that weapon against them. Every Mongol garrison that surrendered was treated with calculated mercy. Every one that resisted was obliterated so completely that stories of their fate spread terror through the remaining strongholds. The message was clear. The age of Mongol invincibility was over. A new power had risen in the east, and it showed no mercy to those who stood in its way. The transformation was remarkable to witness. Cities that had cowered before Mongol banners now threw open their gates to Mamluk forces. Populations that had accepted subjugation as inevitable now rose in rebellion against their occupiers. The psychological earthquake that began at Ain Jalut rippled outward until it reached the very foundations of Mongol power in the region. In the Christian kingdoms of Europe, the news of Mongol defeat was received with a mixture of relief and opportunity. For decades, European rulers had lived under the shadow of Eastern conquest. The destruction of Kiev, the devastation of Poland, the narrow escape of Western Europe during the Mongol withdrawal after Ögedei Khan's death, all of these memories haunted the nightmares of kings and emperors. Now, suddenly, the monster seemed mortal. Diplomatic envoys began flowing between European courts and Cairo. The same Mamluks who had fought against the Crusades were now potential allies against a common enemy. Political marriages were proposed. Trade agreements were negotiated. The balance of power that had seemed frozen in Mongol favor began to shift with tectonic force. But perhaps the most profound impact was felt in the Islamic world itself. For 3 years, Muslims from Spain to India had watched in horror as their civilization was systematically dismantled. The fall of Baghdad had seemed like the end of their golden age. Scholars fled westward carrying what books they could save. Merchants abandoned trade routes that had connected the Islamic world for centuries. The faithful questioned whether Allah had abandoned them to the fury of the pagans. Ain Jalut changed everything. Suddenly, resistance seemed possible. If the Mamluks could defeat the Mongols in open battle, then perhaps other Muslim rulers could do the same. Revolts erupted across Mongol-occupied territories. Local governors who had collaborated with the invaders found themselves facing angry populations emboldened by Mamluk success. The theological implications were equally significant. Islamic scholars who had struggled to explain how God could permit such devastation to befall the faithful now found new purpose in proclaiming Ain Jalut as divine intervention. The battle became not just a military victory, but a religious awakening that reinvigorated Islamic identity across the known world. In the years that followed, this religious fervor would fuel a remarkable cultural renaissance. The Mamluk Sultanate became a magnet for Islamic scholarship, attracting refugees from Mongol-destroyed cities who brought with them the accumulated wisdom of centuries. Cairo replaced Baghdad as the intellectual center of the Islamic world, its libraries and universities growing fat with manuscripts saved from the flames of conquest. The military innovations displayed at Ain Jalut also began to spread and evolve. The hand cannons that had terrified Mongol horses were refined and improved. Within decades, gunpowder weapons would appear on battlefields from Andalusia to the Caucasus, fundamentally altering the nature of medieval warfare. The Mamluks had not just defeated the Mongols, they had ushered in a new age of military technology. Yet for all its historical significance, Ain Jalut remained incomplete as a victory. The Mongol Empire still controlled vast territories from Iran to China. Hulagu still commanded enormous armies, even if he couldn't deploy them against Egypt. The war was far from over. It had simply entered a new phase where the initiative had shifted to the Islamic world. This reality was not lost on the Mamluk leadership. Sultan Qutuz, who had shown such courage in confronting the Mongol threat, would not live to see the full fruits of his victory. Within months of Ain Jalut, he was assassinated by his own commanders in a palace coup that brought Baibars to power. The general who had masterminded the defeat of the Mongols now became the Sultan who would have to defend that victory against inevitable counterattack. Under Baibars' rule, the Mamluk Sultanate transformed from a regional power into a major player on the world stage. His intelligence networks rivaled those of the Mongols themselves. His diplomatic corps established relationships from Europe to the Indian Ocean. His military machine, tempered by victory at Ain Jalut, became the most feared force in the eastern Mediterranean. The ripple effects continued to spread outward like circles on a pond. In distant Mongolia, where the Great Khan held court, the defeat at Ain Jalut forced a fundamental reassessment of imperial strategy. The age of unlimited expansion was over. The Mongols would have to learn to coexist with powers they could not easily conquer, a lesson that would reshape their approach to governance and diplomacy for generations. The psychological impact on individual Mongol warriors was equally profound. These were men who had been raised on stories of inevitable victory, who had learned from childhood that resistance to Mongol rule was not just futile but literally unthinkable. The defeat at Ain Jalut shattered that worldview like glass, forcing an entire generation of warriors to confront the possibility of failure. Some adapted by becoming more cautious, more calculating in their approach to warfare. Others were consumed by a desire for revenge that would drive them to take increasingly desperate risks. Still others simply lost the will to fight, their confidence broken by the knowledge that the sons of Genghis Khan were not, in fact, invincible. As autumn turned to winter in the year 1260, the world began to adjust to a new reality. The Mongol Empire, which had seemed on the verge of global dominion, now faced limits it had never encountered before. The Islamic world, which had teetered on the brink of extinction, now pulsed with renewed life and purpose. And in the courts of Europe, rulers who had spent decades planning for Mongol invasion now began to dream of something far more ambitious. The age of conquest was giving way to an age of competition, and at the center of it all, like a stone that had redirected the flow of a mighty river, stood the memory of what had happened on a September day at a place called Ain Jalut, the spring where Goliath fell, and the world discovered that even giants could bleed. The Battle of Ain Jalut stands as one of history's greatest turning points, a moment when the seemingly impossible became reality through courage, strategy, and perfect timing. From the ashes of Baghdad to the hills of Palestine, we witnessed how a single day of battle could reshape the destiny of civilizations. The Mamluks didn't just defeat an army, they shattered a myth that had terrorized the world for 4 decades. Baibars proved that even the mightiest empire could stumble when it met the right enemy at the right place. The spring of Goliath had claimed another giant, and the world would never be the same.